Before Viking raids entered Western chronicles, Scandinavian shipwrights were already splitting oak, twisting rope, and fitting iron rivets beside sheltered water. Their work belonged to societies older than the Viking Age, yet it created the practical choices that later made overseas violence possible. No contemporary Scandinavian narrative describes this preparation because the surviving local record is mostly objects, settlements, graves, and brief inscriptions. Foreign writers noticed northern peoples intermittently, usually when trade, diplomacy, or conflict brought them across Roman and post-Roman frontiers. The story before 793 therefore begins with scattered testimony, then moves beneath the ground where ordinary labor left firmer traces. Roman authors used broad northern labels that cannot be mapped neatly onto later Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, or Viking crews. Imported glass, bronze vessels, coins, and weapons nevertheless show Scandinavian elites participating in long exchange networks during the Roman Iron Age. Those goods did not require every owner to travel south, since objects could pass repeatedly through merchants, allies, soldiers, and gift exchanges. Local workshops transformed imported ideas rather than simply copying them, producing distinctive metalwork, ornaments, and weapon fittings for regional audiences. Power accumulated around households able to command land, livestock, craft specialists, armed followers, and access to navigable coasts. After the Western Roman Empire fragmented, Scandinavian connections changed rather than disappearing, and gold became especially visible in elite display. Bracteates, small stamped gold pendants inspired partly by Roman coin imagery, carried northern designs whose exact meanings remain debated. Large gold hoards also reveal insecurity or ritual deposition, although archaeology rarely identifies the particular crisis behind a buried treasure. During the migration period, halls and rich graves suggest competitive centers rather than a single kingdom ruling all Scandinavia. Gudme and Uppåkra combined elite residences, specialized production, and imported wealth long before nearby coastal traffic became associated with Viking fleets. Its name is medievally recorded, while archaeology establishes the earlier settlement without revealing what its inhabitants called their political community. At Uppåkra in Scania, centuries of occupation produced weapons, ornaments, imported glass, and evidence for concentrated ritual and political activity. Their rulers remain largely anonymous because early runic inscriptions usually name individuals or objects without narrating dynastic history. The 6th century introduced a severe environmental shock visible far beyond Scandinavia. Ice cores and tree rings register major volcanic events beginning in 536, followed by unusually cool years across the northern hemisphere. Scandinavian archaeology cannot convert that climate signal into a single uniform catastrophe, yet farming communities certainly faced shortened growing conditions. Later deposits of gold may relate to upheaval, sacrifice, or changing power, but no surviving text explains their owners' decisions. Some settlements contracted, while regional hierarchies shifted, making resilience dependent upon stored food, livestock, exchange partners, and controlled labor. When conditions improved, new elite landscapes emerged, especially around the Baltic and the approaches linking islands, lakes, and open sea. The Vendel period, named after rich burials in central Sweden, covers much of the era immediately preceding conventional Viking chronology. Boat graves at Vendel and Valsgarde contained helmets, weapons, animals, gaming pieces, and imported goods arranged for exceptional funerals. Such graves demonstrate concentrated resources and maritime symbolism, but they do not prove that every buried man commanded raiding expeditions. Their decorated helmets share artistic connections with finds in Anglo-Saxon England, revealing communication across the North Sea before Lindisfarne. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo belongs to East Anglia, yet its objects illuminate a maritime aristocratic culture spanning several shores. Similarity need not mean Scandinavian conquest, because craftsmen, gifts, marriages, mercenaries, and political emulation could carry styles between courts. Later heroic poetry remembers kings distributing rings in halls, a social ideal consistent with elite generosity, but preserved through much later manuscripts. Beowulf contains Scandinavian settings and names, though its uncertain composition history prevents its use as a straightforward report from 6th century Denmark. Archaeological halls at Ribe show that imposing gathering places existed where later Danish tradition located legendary royal power. Excavation confirms repeated monumental buildings, not the detailed deeds attributed to the Silding dynasty in medieval literature. This distinction protects an important conclusion. Halls were real political instruments, even when the stories attached to them cannot be verified. Inside them, feasts converted agricultural surplus into obligation, displayed access to distant goods, and bound followers to powerful hosts. Outside them, households carried the burden through planting, herding, food preservation, textile production, and the maintenance of buildings and boats. Elite mobility rested upon that dispersed work, including dependent labor and slavery, whose early scale is difficult to measure securely. Water organized these communities more effectively than modern roadmaps suggest. Fjords, sounds, rivers, and island passages joined farms to seasonal assemblies, fishing grounds, workshops, and neighboring power centers. Clinker construction, with overlapping planks fastened together, created light hulls that flexed in rough water and could be beached easily. Technique developed over centuries, as demonstrated by Scandinavian boat, finds that long predate the classic Viking warship. The Hjortspring boat from Denmark is much earlier and sewn rather than riveted, proving no sudden invention launched the Viking Age. Nydam's 4th century oak boat used iron fastenings and rowing power, bringing the construction tradition closer to later sea-going forms. Neither vessel should be called a Viking longship, because each belonged to a different period, design, and operational world. Their sequence reveals accumulated knowledge transmitted among craftspeople who understood timber grain, hull balance, repair, and coastal conditions. Sails eventually expanded range and flexibility, although the chronology of their Scandinavian adoption remains less securely documented than clinker building. Iconography and later ship finds indicate sailing before and during the early Viking Age, but no single artifact records the decisive transition. Maritime skill alone did not create raiding, since capable boats also served fishing, transport, warfare within Scandinavia, and peaceful exchange. By the 8th century, specialized trading settlements made those combinations easier to assemble. Ribe in western Denmark developed around the early 8th century as a seasonal marketplace connected to the North Sea. Its excavated workshops produced beads, combs, metal objects, and other goods amid evidence of repeated commercial activity. Standardized practices and concentrated craft production meant strangers could meet, bargain, exchange information, and provision onward journeys. Across the Baltic, places such as Helgo had earlier linked northern communities with objects arriving from extraordinarily distant networks. Imported material at Helgo includes goods with origins far beyond Scandinavia, but their presence does not identify direct Scandinavian voyages to every source. Havoken on Gotland and other landing places demonstrate how islands could mediate traffic before later towns dominated regional commerce. These markets gathered ship crews and intelligence without drawing a clean boundary between merchant, warrior, diplomat, and pirate. A person might participate in different kinds of voyage across a lifetime, while legal status and opportunity shaped who could choose. Portable silver increasingly offered wealth that could be weighed, divided, gifted, hidden, or converted into political support. Before Islamic dirhams arrived northward in great quantities during the Viking Age, Western coins and bullion already circulated unevenly. Exchange remained partly personal and political because valuables moved through tribute, hospitality, alliance, marriage, and compensation, as well as purchase. Fortifications provide another sign that organized violence was already familiar within the north. The Danevirke's earliest phases protected the southern Jutland corridor. Although its construction history includes several enlargements across different periods, dendrochronology has helped date early work to the 8th century, demonstrating substantial coordination before the most famous overseas attacks. Building ramparts required timber, earth, transport, food, planning, and authority over workers, not merely a band of adventurous fighters. Defensive investment also reveals threats within and around Scandinavia, where rival leaders competed over routes and communities. Weapons deposited in earlier wetlands, including finds from Illerup Odal and Nedam, testify to organized conflicts centuries before Viking raids. Long experience of assembling forces nevertheless provided social mechanisms that could later be redirected beyond Scandinavian waters. The island of Saaremaa preserves unusually direct evidence for overseas armed movement before the traditional Viking threshold. Salme in Estonia, 2 buried vessels held dozens of men, weapons, gaming pieces, animals, and other objects from the early 8th century. Scientific analyses indicate many of the dead probably came from the Lake Mälaren region of central Sweden. Their deaths occurred outside Scandinavia, but archaeology cannot fully reconstruct the mission, the opponents, or the circumstances of burial. Salme, therefore, narrows the question more effectively than a saga. Armed maritime expeditions existed before Western monks recorded Viking attacks. It also prevents 793 from becoming an invented technological birthday for northern seafaring. What changed near the end of the 8th century was visibility within surviving Western European writing, not the sudden appearance of ships. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records northern ships reaching the English coast before the Lindisfarne attack, though its annalistic dating presents difficulties. Its famous account of the royal official killed after approaching the newcomers is retrospective and terse, leaving motives uncertain. In 793, the assault on Lindisfarne produced stronger contemporary reverberations because the monastery belonged to influential Christian networks. Alcuin, writing from the Carolingian world, interpreted the disaster through moral and religious concerns rather than Scandinavian strategy. His letters convey genuine shock while telling us little about the attackers' identities, home regions, organization, or route. Later chronicles made Lindisfarne a memorable opening, and modern periodization turned that remembered shock into a convenient boundary. Yet boundaries drawn from literate victims, privilege events that entered their archives over earlier violence beyond those institutions. Archaeology supplies the missing depth without granting names to every crew or motives to every leader. By 793, northern societies already possessed seaworthy traditions, military followings, competitive elites, marketplaces, and knowledge carried through mobile networks. None of those conditions made raids inevitable, and neighboring regions combined them in different proportions and at different times. Population growth may have contributed locally, but it cannot serve as a universal explanation for expansion across all Scandinavian landscapes. Political exclusion, inheritance pressures, commercial opportunity, and elite competition remain plausible factors whose relative weight varied by expedition. Targets also shaped the outcome, since exposed religious communities held portable wealth and participated in poorly defended coastal systems. Once successful attacks returned goods, captives, and information, demonstration effects could encourage repetition without requiring a common master plan. The people financing boats, preparing food, weaving cloth, and managing farms were consequently tied to expansion even when they never sailed. Captives bore the harshest consequences, entering systems of forced movement and dependency that accompanied commerce and warfare. Communities abroad adapted as well, improving defenses, paying tribute, negotiating alliances, and sometimes recruiting Scandinavians into local struggles. The first raids were therefore encounters between changing societies, not an isolated eruption from a timeless northern culture. Before the label Viking Age, Scandinavia contained many political communities whose languages and customs overlapped without forming one nation. Their earlier centuries built capacities, survived disruptions, and connected shores, but they did not preserve a single account of becoming Vikings. The securely established record reaches a precise boundary. Maritime expansion preceded Lindisfarne, while the decisions behind individual voyages remain mostly unknown. Salme fixes armed travelers east of Scandinavia, Ribe fixes organized exchange. Early Danevirke fixes coordinated power in southern Jutland. Together, these traces replace a sudden beginning with a long, uneven preparation visible across different kinds of evidence. Lindisfarne still matters, not as the birth of Scandinavian seafaring, but as the moment a Western archive made one raid historically thunderous. The Viking Age begins cleanly only on modern timelines. Along Scandinavian shores, its machinery had been taking shape for generations.